We picked a topic for this afternoon that isn't about the dark political landscape. Instead, we're going to dissect an oral history of the New York Post that, according to its subtitle, examines rogues, renegades, wise guys. They're such entertaining characters. The authors, Susan Mulcahy, right here in the middle, and Frank DiGiacomo, titled it Paper of Wreckage. To get the best anecdotes and the juiciest tidbits, which they organize very well into a more or less chronological overview, they interviewed more than 240 former and current staffers, and it took them 4 years, I just learned today, many of whom are in this room. In fact, I'd like to see a show of hands, how many people would call themselves posties, people who have worked, yeah. Wow, yes, all over, yeah. Well, that's great. This table that I was sitting at over there, we have two outstanding posties. One, our former president, Joe Berger. You want to just, yeah. And the guy to whom the authors dedicated their book, Myron Rushetzky, a longtime staffer. Everyone seems to know him. And he now runs an email group called Post Nation. Susan and Frank both worked at the Post as writers and at different times as the editor of the infamous Page 6. Susan asked for a moderator who has not worked at the New York Post. And so I suggested my friend and fellow Silurian and former Newsday colleague, I can't see you now, but there you are, Sheryl McCarthy. Yay, Sheryl, yeah. She is now a distinguished lecturer in journalism at Queens College, and she interviews authors and other people on a weekly basis, or on a weekly talk show that's called One to One at CUNY TV. And so I'll now hand this over to Sheryl.
I have never worked for the New York Post. It's frankly been years since I've read the New York Post. And I never watch Fox News for more than a few seconds at a time. But I have read all 500 pages of Paper of Wreckage. It's a lively and exhaustive oral history of how the Post has evolved over time, what it was like working there, and the impact that Post has had on journalism. In the late 70s and 80s, when I was a reporter in New York City, my impression of the Post was that it was somewhat disreputable, sensational, certainly right-wing, sometimes entertaining, but not to be trusted. But I would always hear rumors about a golden age of the New York Post when the paper was owned by Dorothy Schiff and was quite reputable and quite progressive. What was, and you talk about the Schiff era, what was the Post like when Dorothy Schiff was the owner?
Was in the 1950s when Jimmy Wexler was the editor. And if you've read The Power Broker, you will see a lot of the Wexler-Schiff Post in that book, because the reporters there conducted all of these major investigations into figures like Robert Moses, Joseph McCarthy, Walter Winchell. Eventually, Wexler was shoved aside to the opinion pages, and Paul Sam became the editor. But it was a training ground for people that became the stars of journalism at the New York Times. Anna Quinlan, Frank Rich, Jane Perlez, Clyde Haberman, Joyce Wadler, so many people, many of them Silurians, who worked at the Post and then went on to, and were quite successful there, but went on to even greater things. So, and it was an environment that was very welcoming to women, doing more than just, the gardening and the cooking column. Women were treated with a lot of respect. They had a lot of interesting positions. So and things changed drastically when Murdoch took over. As one reporter said, it was like Sid Vicious taking over the Philharmonic.
About the physical environment of 210 South Street, I heard it was really a dump, and the neighborhood was really rough, and the Dorothy Schiff was really cheap.
So you want to go to the sandwich route?
Yeah, Dorothy Schiff was really cheap, and people feel that if she had invested more in the paper when her final years, I think Jane Perlez described it as very sad, that she didn't want to put any money to, I mean, you couldn't take a taxi anywhere. If you got a letter that had an uncanceled stamp on it, you had to steam it off and reuse it. And Warren Hogue told me that he heard about the Mylay massacre from Seymour Hersh before the story was released. And it wasn't that expensive for the Post to be part of the group of newspapers that ran it, but no, too expensive for Dorothy Schiff. So they missed out on that.
So Rupert Murdoch buys the paper in 1976. How did the paper change?
It was drastic. I think Frank Rich says it was like the Nazis marching into Poland. They started cutting copy sometimes, and it wouldn't even make sense when it ran. There was a great deal of writing the headline before the story came and fitting the story to the headline, which is part of how Headless Body and Topless Bar happened. And there was a lot of manipulation, especially in the political arena, when the mayoral race happened with Koch.
You mentioned the headline, the most famous Post headline, Headless Body and Topless Bar. And one of the things I learned from your book was that it really wasn't a topless bar, right?
Well, it kind of was actually, the ADA who tried the case, he did say it was a topless bar. Some of the reporters and editors said it wasn't really. They sent somebody up to look in the window, and they saw a picture of somebody topless and said, yeah, it's a topless bar. But the ADA described it as a topless bar. So Peter Dunn, who we were delighted to track down because that's such a funny headline, but the story behind the headline is not funny at all.
The importance of the wood, which basically the front page headline, the all importance, the wood. I had never heard that term before, but why was the wood so important?
I mean, it was the billboard. It was the billboard for the Post. It sold papers, and for the Post at that time, newsstand sales were everything. Actually, we learned that two people who moved newsstand sales were John Gotti and Donald Trump. Both referred to at different times as Teflon Don.
But also, it was important because the Post couldn't depend on subscription sales. It really depended so heavily on newsstand sales. So it really had to put a lot of emphasis on what was going to be on the front page in order to sell papers.
Right.
They would also change, it was the clickbait of its day in that there was a period in the early 80s where there were 8 editions a day. And they would often change the headline, the wood for every single edition. And there's a guy named Jim Farber who wrote for the Daily News, who was a great interview because he had such an interesting perspective on the Post. He said it was like an art project. You'd get on the subway and there might be 6 or 8 people reading the Post, and they'd all have a different wood, and it would look like it was customized for them. But it was all about, okay, that one, Jim Wilsey, who many of you probably know, who was the editor of the Daily News, he was good friends with John Cotter, who was an editor for a long time at both the Post and Newsday. He said Cotter and Dave Banks would look out the window to, where there was a newsstand, and if it wasn't selling, like, new wood for the next edition.
Were there any ethical standards at the Post, or were there any things that you were not supposed to do or were supposed to do?
Well, a number of people we talked to said that it really came down to you, like what lines are you going to cross and what lines will you not cross. So a number of these people said that they weren't necessarily pushed, but other people were willing to go over the line.
Also, I think that's some of the reporters. There was a guy named Hal Davis, who many of you may know, who was the state Supreme Court reporter. He could have worked at the Times. Hal was an amazing reporter. And he said he made his piece. He had a courtroom full of great stories. He didn't need to make anything up. And he was treated well by Dunleavy. And he actually liked working for Dunleavy, even though this is Steve Dunleavy, the infamous Steve Dunleavy, who drank more than anyone who's ever been born. But there were people like Hal there that just figured out a way. And, you know, look at the many people that worked for the Murdoch Post that went on. Maggie Haberman trained at the Murdoch Post. Richie Esposito worked there before he went on to get a Pulitzer Prize at Newsday. There were many, many people. Devlin Barrett, who went to the Washington Post and was part of a Pulitzer Prize winning team. So, and also, honestly, Frank and I both worked on Page Six, so of course we're going to pat ourselves on the back, but Page Six had very high ethical and journalistic standards because it was the most, other than the front and the back page, it was the most read page in the paper and one of the most read in the city. And once it became inaccurate, it would lose a lot of its clout. So Page Six was held to a very high standard.
Murdoch hired some really colorful staffers, not always colorful in a good way. But sometimes. I'd like each of you to pick one of the characters who sort of looms large in your mind and tell me something about him.
Well, Miss Gary actually wasn't hired by Murdoch, but she fit very well into the Murdoch scheme. She was, I don't know what her title was, general manager or in charge of everything from pencils to painting the building to, she seemed to me to be about 6'5". I don't know how tall she was, but she was tall. And she was this big woman who was, I was terrified of her. She yelled at me once and I thought I was just going to die in the office. But everybody had a Miss Gary story. There was a union meeting once. She was the head of the union for a while, but by the 80s she was not anymore. And she wasn't getting what she wanted out of the negotiations, so she slapped a can of Vaseline on the table and said, "If you're going to fuck me, use this." And she had a couple of relatives, shall we say, who were constantly painting the building. And when I was the assistant on Page Six, when Jim Brady, Claudia Cohen left, and Jim Brady came in as the editor who had created Page Six several years earlier, and they were so excited about Jim coming back that Miss Gary came in with one of her cousins and just painted the corner of this unbelievably filthy room and didn't touch anything else, just the corner where Jim would be sitting. And George Artz, who was the City Hall bureau chief, mentioned that one year he was doing political endorsements with Dick Montague, who had worked for Jimmy Wexler, and a guy named Mike DeMarco was running, and they didn't endorse him. And there was some sort of redistricting, and the next year he's on the ballot again, and Dick says, "We're endorsing him this year." And George said, "Why? We didn't endorse him last time." "He's Miss Gary's cousin. Last year she took all of my furniture out of the office." So that was Miss Gary.
I don't think you can talk about the Post without talking about Steve Dunleavy. He is really the personification of the Post during its wildest years. Australian, as you might guess. Someone once described his hair as a hood ornament. And Steve was just one of these guys who was a prodigious drinker and could actually work while under influence. But his antics were legend there. We have one story where he was having sex with a woman outside Elaine's that was hit by a snowplow and thrown into the street. Broke his leg. And Pete Hamill said, "I hope it wasn't his riding foot." And another time he impersonated a hospital grief counselor when Son of Sam's last victim was killed, and he found the mother and took her aside and got a scoop. And she didn't know she was being quoted, and apparently she didn't care once she was in the paper. And Steve may or may not have had an affair with her. The final thing, well, there's so many, but one of the stories we love is during the more modern Post, after it moved up to 6th Avenue, Steve came into the office on a bender one night and threw up on his boss's desk. didn't bother to clean it up. And when the boss called him on it the next day, he said, "What's the big deal?"
Behavior in the Post newsroom was like something out of Caligula. So much drinking, sex in the news building, fights in the newsroom, cocaine use in the newsroom, drug dealing, and I'm sure sexual harassment. I don't even know if there's a question there. I'm just amazed that all of this went on. One of perhaps the most unique creation of the New York Post was Page 6, which you both worked on. So how was it different from traditional gossip reporting?
Well, it wasn't tied to the brilliance. I always thought of its creation, and it was Murdoch's idea, although Jim Brady executed his idea, was that it was not tied to a single person. Most gossip columns were, Hedda Hopper, Liz Smith. And if that person left, that was the end of the column. But Page 6 was always written in first person plural, we hear this, we hear that. And when an editor would leave, that wasn't the end of the column. So, and it was supposed to have, now it's really different. Frank and I have talked about this. It's a lot of the content on Page 6. I still read it every day and enjoy it, but it's tied to more national figures, especially reality TV stars. But back in the day, it was Murdoch wanted political news. We had a lot of political stories on Page 6. He wanted media stories, Wall Street, New York society, entertainment, and it was supposed to be about the corridors of power, and Page 6 helped create celebrities. I think Page 6 had a big impact in making political consultants known more. If you walk down the street now and tell them the name of 3 well-known political consultants, they're not going to know who they are. But in the business, their profile was elevated by constant appearances on Page 6.
One of the really hot tips that Page 6 got was when you published a list of all the salaries of the Wall Street Journal executives. I can imagine that set off quite a furor.
Richard Johnson in that says that there's nothing worse you can do than publish a list of someone's salaries, company salaries, and things really were, it was a real response. I think it was Mr. Mole, his name was.
Yes, well, tell me about Mr.
But what was it like working for Page 6?
For me, it was, I was there at a time when Peter Calico owned the paper, and I think we were constantly on the verge of bankruptcy, and finally we did go into bankruptcy. So there was a lot of stress about knowing whether you're going to have a job the next day. And then Page 6 is it's a real grinder. You are out almost every night, and you're asking people difficult questions. They're not responding well. And it just really, at a wedding I covered, Robert De Niro was there, and I was introduced to him, and when he said, your name, he goes, your name, where do you work? And I said, Page 6, and he said, Page 6, you fucking prick. And then he turned away from me.
Circulation went up under the Murdoch regime, until it didn't. What audience was he trying to appeal to?
Well, at the beginning, he incorrectly guessed, and this is a bit of it's not like Murdoch told us this, but a number of people said this must have been what he wanted to do, was to create a newspaper that would have major circulation like some of his papers in London, like The Sun and News of the World, and didn't necessarily depend on advertising. And he wanted to get that kind of Italian, Irish Catholic audience, not realizing, because he didn't know the city, that audience had already left. And they were reading, if they were here, they were reading the Daily News and they weren't going to go to the Post. But he eventually, the Post began to realize that they were getting a lot of Wall Street people, because he did make the paper kind of pop and make it more fun. And the Daily News had to step up, and They definitely did. Jim Wilsey said when he'd lived in California for a while, when he came back to New York, he was sent to London for a few weeks to work with an editor there to learn what he called the dark art of tabloids, because the news knew that it needed to inject some of the oomph that the Post had. But they had a lot of Wall Street people, and it became a little bit, I mean, I don't know people here, I know there's some people here who work for Fairchild. It became a little bit like the old Women's Wear Daily audience of people that were not in the fashion business were reading Women's Wear Daily, and there were people that you wouldn't think of as typical New York Post readers who were reading the New York Post.
And there was also a little bit of a schizophrenia there, because I think the crime stories and the local politics appealed to sort of the average Joe. So you had this intention of attracting the Wall Streeters and then the borough dwellers.
My sense was, I mean, in the 70s, that the Post was the newspaper that black New Yorkers read, probably more so, and they also read the news, probably more so, certainly than the Times. And yet the Post attitude towards blacks was not very good. You had race baiting, little interest in crimes against blacks, certainly demonization of black youths, and they certainly had few black employees, because it seemed to me when I was working for the Daily News, the Post would always have one black reporter, and maybe one black photographer, and when that reporter left, they have one other black reporter, but that was sort of as far as that got.
Well, when Dolly Schiff owned it, I mean, no newspaper in New York was a model of diversity the way we think of diversity now, but the Post was better than anyone else. And they also had, there was a parody.
They were better than anyone else?
Oh yeah, they had black column. This is when Dorothy Schiff owned it.
Oh.
Not when, no, everything changed when Murdoch came in. When Murdoch came in, it changed drastically. And there was, even the photo editor, a reporter named Amy Pagnozzi said she was told once by the photo editor that, black people don't photograph well. So I interviewed the photo editor, and he said, I don't remember saying that, but I could have, and I'm not going to, he was really honest about it. He said, I could have, and I'm not proud of it now if I did. But there was definitely, I think when you were there 5? Flo said there were 5 black.
Yeah, I think 5 people.
Yeah, there was a black journalist convention or something in LA, and the guy from the Daily News who was going to the convention said, you guys can't even fill up a taxi cab. And there was definitely the way they covered the black community. We interviewed Yusuf Salam, who's now a city council person as part of the Exonerated 5, and he said the way the Post covered his trial and everything else just broke him. It was so bad.
The Post loved Donald Trump long before he got involved in politics. Your book said that he was on the front page more than 20 times between 1988 and 1993, which is amazing. I mean, did Rupert Murdoch just like Donald Trump, or what was it? I just felt that he was good.
As I said earlier, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons. First of all, he sold newspapers, although that had to be discovered. Donald Trump's mentor was Roy Cohn, and Rupert Murdoch was close to Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn became a huge source of the paper. So there was that connection. As Cindy Adams tells us that she was introduced to Donald Trump by Roy Cohn, and once Donald Trump sort of became friends with Cindy, he really, for instance, he put in her security system, so she tells us that she will never say a bad word about Donald Trump because she considered a friend. And then Trump holds the record, I believe, still for the most page 1 stories when he had the affair with Marla Maples. So there is a certain popularity, and both Susan and I bet everyone else who worked at the column, really became weary of all the stories that Donald Trump would try to plant, either sometimes himself or through a publicist named John Barron, who sounded a lot like Donald Trump. And I find it odd, too, that his youngest son is named Barron. So I don't know if there's any... So that's just a few of the factors.
Yeah, and Trump, I became wary of him, and I left Page Six in 1985, but he lied so often that I really became wary of running stories about him. And I wish I'd banned him from the column, but it was hard, and everybody here has experienced this. If you have PR people you know and like, and you're having a slow news day, and they're like, hey, can you throw... there were probably too many instances of that, but I will say, and I did write a memoir in 1988 about doing Page Six, and I had a half a chapter about what a liar Donald Trump is. But, that book did not sell well enough, that's all. But he really, the Post, in a way, was the way he learned how to use the tabloids as essentially a public address system, paved the way for what he is doing now and how he got into the White House.
We think of the Post under Murdoch as being far to the right politically, but he didn't just support Republican politicians. He was a big fan of Ed Koch, right? And Ed Koch became the first. The Post ran an endorsement for him, I guess when he was running for, I don't know if it was mayor or for mayor, on the front page, which it had never done before, never run an endorsement on the front page. So what was it about Ed Koch?
Murdoch looked at all the candidates. This was in the Democratic primary, and he looked at Herman Badillo, he looked at Cuomo, and Dave Garth kind of convinced him that Koch was most in line with his thinking. And Koch used to call himself a sane liberal. So Murdoch found that appealing. And Murdoch knew he was in a city where the Democrats usually win. So even though he may have been conservative politically, he realized that perhaps backing this Democrat would be a good idea. But the way he went about it, Joyce Pernick told us that she wanted to leave the Post, but she was trying to get severance. And she was asked to do stories that she knew about polls, for instance, that were invented. And she refused to participate in them. And Murdoch was kind of using her as he used Murray Kempton when Murray was at the Post to say, how can you say those terrible things about me? I have Joyce Pernick here. I have Murray Kempton. They're so liberal. But he really, the way the 77 campaign, it just, I talked to Harold Holzer, who was Bella Abzug's press secretary, and he said nobody had ever seen anything like it before. There would be like 20 stories about Koch, and the endorsements were on the front page, which had never been seen before.
The Post has survived newspaper strikes, bankruptcy, changes in ownership, and right now its circulation is greater than that of the Daily News. What do you think of the current paper?
I still think the crime and local political coverage is good. I find that the Post this is something that criticism of a lot of major media, but they rely on social media instead of reporting for stories. They'll find trends, but there's things that they're taking off Twitter. And they do interview a lot of people, influencers. So I don't know, I feel that in general, journalism, there's not a lot of shoe leather involved now. Certainly the Times and the Post are doing a great job. Washington Post, I meant. Page Six, I have to say it does okay. The minute the internet really took flight, gossip became an almost impossible thing to do on a daily basis in a newspaper. It became instant, and all of these websites began to specialize, whether it was in restaurants or politics or all the things that Page Six covered on its page on a daily basis. So I think they do a decent job. They get Elon Musk on the phone, and they had some interesting stories about Jeff Bezos when he left his wife. So, I don't know.
I think one thing the Post, not just Page Six, I agree with Frank. Whoop, that just died. Is that okay? Oh, there we go. I agree with Frank's assessment of Page Six, the current Page Six, but the paper itself, they're doing something that's just bizarre given how the Post is always looking for stories to pop and get traffic, and they will run when the Hunter Biden mess was at its height. They'd run like 8 pages on Hunter Biden. Who cares? It's boring after a while. Tell me whatever the development is and move on. And when I read the paper now, there's like a huge swath of pages. I'll think, oh, that's the crazy post. Let's get to the part where maybe there's an actual story. Yeah, so I think there is good content in parts of the paper, but their political coverage just remains as insane as ever.
Your title raises the question of how did the people who worked at the Post and how the paper itself redefined American media. How did they?
Well, you see Murdoch coming in and building this sort of foundation of what would become a media empire. It's the Post. And then what happens is when Ted Kennedy forces him to sell it, because Ted Kennedy was a whipping boy of the Post, Murdoch has already gone into television, and he's bought a station group in the major markets, and he's starting a network. One of the first programs he does is something called A Current Affair, which takes a lot of the New York Post, including Steve Dunleavy, over to their production, and essentially takes the Post template for tabloid journalism and puts it on television, and it's very successful. So then you have all these copycat other shows like Inside Edition, which is still on the air, and then from there Murdoch starts Fox News, and that is essentially the New York Post political coverage, national political coverage on a cable network. And then this is another theory I have, MSNBC becomes progressive left. And so everybody's preaching to their own audiences. And so now we have a very fragmented media. It's really hard to tell what is true and what isn't. And that's how we got here.
I'll follow that with one of the quotes from the book. Without Rupert Murdoch and the New York Post, there's no Fox News. Without Fox News, there's no Donald Trump. And without Donald Trump, there would not be all those people dead from COVID. So I want to thank you for a very lively, readable book, and I urge you all to read it. And I'm going to open up for questions.
And the man next to me has a question.
David Margolick, question for Frank. You mentioned, you sort of glossed over the idea of Donald Trump buying Cindy Adams' security system. And I wonder how often you identify or you know about Post reporters or Post columnists taking payola to write stories or being, to get themselves into the pocket of various newsmakers.
Another thing that Donald Trump did for Cindy Adams and lend her his helicopter so she could spread Joey's ashes over Central Park. So, I don't. You probably remember there was a Page 6 scandal. I think in the 2008, 2000.
Sometime in the August.
Yeah, where one of the reporters was accused of trying to extort money from I'm forgetting, Ron Burkle, and then that led to suspicions of Richard, which he, I guess, admitted of accepting cash for play. Other than that, I really, I worked with Joanna Malloy and George Rush at Page 6. They were incredibly ethical. They were great reporters. Flo Anthony was very well connected. I wasn't exposed to the news desk so much because I had come in not through the copy boy process. So I can't really say, oh yeah, it was everywhere. Those are the things that, and Cindy was quite open about it.
And never paid a price for it.
No. Well, and she also apparently never pays for a meal too when she goes there.
We have a question back here.
Harvey Araton, as someone who's worked for the Post, the Daily News, and the Times in sports, I feel compelled to ask how much of the Post's continued success, circulation gains, do you think have to do with its comprehensive coverage of sports, particularly in a city now where the Times has kind of outsourced its sports coverage to a national site that the stories often have little to do with New York. The Daily News has probably like 5 sports reporters on its staff and is virtually invisible. But the Post has continued to pour considerable resources into covering sports, sending its people all over the place. How much of it, because it's gone unmentioned, and I feel like, I just want to ask, like, how much of its success do you think has to do with the fact that it's still considered one of the leaders in sports coverage, not only in New York, but around the country?
I think that is a major factor, because I encountered somebody, it was a young person that lived in like Chicago, and they asked me, when I told them what I was working on, the book I was working on, they read the New York Post sports section. That really shocked me. We don't get into that in the book in terms of the Post's current state, whether or not, but I think that probably is, because that's the one area where they spend a lot of money. And also there are a lot of recognizable bylines there, including people that were there in the 70s, like Phil Mushnick, Steve Serby, and it's interesting, the only publicity this book has gotten in the current New York Post is Mike Vaccaro, who's the lead sports columnist, and I think you probably don't tell him what to do. He gave us a nice plug in his column, but other than that, they're totally ignoring us.
Over here.
Yes, my name is Salvatore Arena, and I worked for the Daily News for 35 years. I have a little story to tell, touch on a few bases you mentioned here. But when I was assigned to Manhattan Supreme Court in 1983, that's when I met Hal Davis. And you mentioned that Hal is a brilliant guy and probably one of the smartest guys I've ever come across. But my first day in the press room, I noticed, but didn't give it much thought, there were 2 phones on my desk. And when one of them rang, Hal would come running over, and he was a big guy. I mean, he was wide, let me put it that way, and he'd answer that phone. And this happened several times, and I said to myself, this is no good. I don't want the Post running over to my desk, And so, luckily, I went to college with Myron Rushetzky. and apparently, Hal didn't have a phone. He used the house phone and the pay phone for years. So I called Myron and I said, Myron, we have to get Hal a phone. He had to get him his own phone to get away from my desk. And that all worked out. Myron got the phone for Hal, and the rest is history.
And that was not even in the Dorothy Schiff era. So it was still cheap, but not as cheap as in the 70s, I think.
Thank you. My name is Ellen Freilich. I would like to just hear a little bit more about diversity in the newsroom during the Dorothy Schiff era and how it came about. And then I just wanted to mention that since you said that the Post relied so much on newsstand sales, I picked up at a Temple rummage sale some Van Gogh prints, which were very vivid in color, so much so that I suspected lead paint. But it said that they were given away in the 1930s by the New York Post in a subscription drive. Wow. Yeah, and they said that Van Gogh at that time was like just huge with, New York audience.
Dorothy Schiff bought the paper in 39, so if that was in the 1930s, that may have been before she bought it. And I think there was a consortium, was that when there was a consortium of people that owned it for a while. That it went through in the before she bought it, it went through a couple of different owners that didn't hold on to it for long. So in terms of diversity in the newsroom, we actually corrected something from the galleys to the book itself. I asked a couple of people, actually it ended up I think being 4 or 5 people, who had worked at the Post for a long time to look at the galleys. We had fact-checked things, but we wanted to make sure we had everything as accurate as possible. And Warren Hogue, Aida Alvarez, and Dick Belsky all described the Schiff Post as not being diverse, right? Those are 3 pretty good, assessments. So Eric Fettman, who worked at the Post for a long time, and he's sort of the Post historian, and he's also a newspaper historian, I'd given him a galley to read, and he said, that's really not fair to the Post, because as I said earlier, according to diversity standards today, the Schiff Post was not diverse, but they had a couple black reporters, which other papers did not have at that time. They had black columnists. So it was more diverse than a lot of places. And they hired Aida Alvarez. They wanted to get someone who was Hispanic. So they made more of an effort. And there was a joke headline that was written. Calvin Trillin actually said he wrote it for a parody of the Post that came in the early 1960s. We had 5 people tell us different versions of it. It was something like, "World ends, Jews, blacks suffer most." And that was sort of the way that the people thought of the Dorothy Schiff's Post outlook.
In the back here.
Hi, I'm Arlene Schulman, and I have a 2-part question. The first part is, I'm just curious. I read the book, love it, very colorful, but I noticed that there weren't any photographs, and I was wondering what was behind the decision not to include any archival or those from personal collections.
You know, our editor said he didn't think we needed photos. There was a point at which we were talking about gathering them, and he said, you know what, I think the stories you're telling are colorful enough that you don't need photos. So.
And your second part?
The second part is we have a couple of people here who moved from the mayhem of the Post to the New York Times, and I was wondering if one, hello Joyce, might be interested in sharing the difference. What do you miss the most moving from the Post to the Times, from that newsroom?
Joyce?
Hi, Tony. I'm Joyce Wadler. I was there just as Murdoch came in. And the New York Post was the best job and the most fun I ever had in a newsroom. I walked in and they were playing puff basketball in the newsroom. I'm trying to think of some of the crazier stories. We were pretty straight. Nobody ever messed around with the news, but it was very fun-loving. And Josh Friedman once said Co-op City was different, that when he walked into Co-op City, he was a hero. People Orthodox Jews used to come in the city room asking where the Jewish women were to give them lights to light. They very quickly realized whether you were a writer or a reporter, a hard news person. They divided the city room into reporters and schreibers. And I was a schreiber, and there were some wonderful late editors, Warren Hogue, Bob Spitzler, Al Ellenberg. Al came around the newsroom once. Yiddish theater was still going on in New York. And he asked if anybody spoke Yiddish or understood Yiddish. I understood a little bit of Yiddish, but not much. But that was more than anybody on my side of the room. So Al sent me to cover a play in Yiddish called Ze Ster, Ze Seine Yid. Joe, did I say that correctly? It's hard to be a Jew. And I said, Al, I don't really understand Yiddish. What do I do? And he said, rave. So it was a wonderful, wonderful place to work. When I went to the Times many, many years later, I walked in and I said, this feels like an insurance office. These people just did not know how to have fun.
Smith, this is not a defense of the New York Post or Rupert Murdoch, just a counterpoint because we've been bashing the hell out of it. In 1980, under Murdoch, the New York Post led a gun control campaign which resulted in New York State passing what was then the toughest gun control law in the nation, and the first time the gun lobby had suffered a setback. Governor Carey nominated the Post for a Pulitzer Prize. We had no delusions. So that year, the Pulitzer Prize went to the Washington Post to Janet Cook.
Hi, Leslie Wayne. Talk to us a little bit about sort of your sources and where you got the material. And I know you said something about going out every night of the week. What's different about that kind of sourcing and reporting that you did than normal reporting?
Well, I think some of it was, I think we did a lot of sort of observational journalism in that we were in the crowd, we witnessed things. But also, we were taught to, approach people and ask them very difficult questions often. And I can't remember a specific example, but I think that was part of it. And sources at page 6, we're not going to reveal any, but we had, for instance, there was a guy named Cy Preston who was a press agent who went back to the days of Walter Winchell. And Cy had like 4 clients. One was the owner of Penthouse. The other was the owner of Chock full of Nuts Coffee. There was a Midgemore's Tennis Club, and he also represented Eau Calcutta among them. And so Cy would send you these items where he would combine all of these people, or at least some of them, like I said this in an interview where he would say, Bob Guccione played tennis at Midgemore's Midtown Tennis Club to celebrate the new issue of Penthouse, and then went to Chock full of Nuts and had a black coffee. But the thing about Cy was, so he would give us these items, and the reason we would go with them is because Cy would give us these amazing stories Cy was a reporter initially, and they checked out, they were accurate, and he was amazing. He gave us some, at least while I was there, he gave us some amazing stories that made national headlines.
Not about chocolate.
No, not about chocolate. No, it had nothing to do with his clients. So there was a little bit of, you scratch my back, so I scratch yours. But believe me, Cy delivered way more in the non-client field than he did with his clients.
I don't think that, I also want to respond. Pat, I see what you're saying. We are bashing the Post a bit here today, but the book is very even-handed, and we make the point that there are like a lot of really terrific writers and editors who worked there over the years under Murdoch and are still there. So, and there still are people there. So I don't want it to come across from this conversation that we're, bashing everybody who worked at the Post in the 80s. And I think that on page 6, what Frank is saying is true. You would have some of these, but we were reporters. We checked stories out the way all reporters check stories out and developed sources in the same way. That wasn't any different.
Over here.
I'm Roberta Gratz, and I was at the Post from the 60s on. I just want to say the Post had one of the greatest black reporters ever, Ted Poston, who was the first black reporter at any major newspaper in the country. He had even covered the Scottsboro Boys. He was a legend. I also remember that whatever year it was in the mid-60s when the first Harlem riots were, the editors looked around and they had no one to go cover. And that was the impetus of hiring the first black reporter, other than Ted.
Clyde Haberman. I just also want to add, I think when I was at the Post, which was from the late 60s to till actually Murdoch's first week coincided with my last, I think the Post alone had more women on its staff than all the other New York newspapers put together. I can't swear to that, but I think under Mrs. Schiff that there was a very conscious effort, and there was supremely talented people, Vern Marja Ekman, Helen Dudar, and others. So the paper obviously changed very quickly. I have a clear memory of Murdoch on that 1 week I was there standing on a desk saying, "Don't believe everything you've read about me, nothing will change." That didn't last.
Hi, Catherine Hires. I was wondering, I've been reading about the Murdoch family and how the sons and daughter are sort of vying for power and taking over the Murdoch empire. I was just wondering if you, given your knowledge of Rupert himself, if you have any opinions about who may win out, how things may play out in the Murdoch empire.
I can't say I have. Look, never bet against Rupert Murdoch. He is, the fact that they were able to get that case, the press can't even cover it, right? Which is amazing for a newspaper, to have that kind of hypocrisy, really. I would say that if there is a chance to win it, that he can find it. He has an amazing legal team. And I think that if he doesn't win, you probably won't see the Post survive.
Well, I think if the kids don't really, there's no evidence that the kids are in love with newspapers. I mean, Lachlan, who is the heir apparent, is, the Post falls within his ken, but I don't get the impression from what I've read and what I've heard that the New York Post is, I'm sure he's fond of it. They probably have, sentimental memories from apparently Archer Winston, the longtime movie and skiing columnist for the Post, taught the kids how to ski. So they probably have some happy memories here and there, but I really doubt they'll keep it going.
Spencer Rumsey, copy kid and copy editor at New York Post, fortunately rescued by New York Newsday. What's your favorite wood?
For me, because I was there, was Best Sex I Ever Had, which I think that is probably the second most popular, or at least memorable, next to Headless Body and Topless Bar.
I like the ones that didn't get in the paper. There was the Hasidic Jews in Williamsburg were protesting the fact that the New York Marathon was going to come through and their roads were not paved properly, so they were going to stand in the middle of the road and stop the marathon runners from coming through. And Wayne Darwin, this very funny Australian editor, came up with a couple headlines that didn't get in the paper. One was Dukes of Hasid, and the other one was Yidlock. So, but they didn't get in the paper.
Yeah, there was
Over here.
Yeah, hi. I'm Tony Mancini. I started at the New York Post, don't fall off your chairs, in 1958 as a copy boy. And I was there during the transition between the Post Rupert and the Post Dorothy Schiff. But I wanted to tell a story that I'm surprised that Roberta didn't tell, because I heard it first at Ted Poston's retirement party. And he was telling a story about how he covered the Medgar Evers trial, and he was sitting in the hallway taking notes when some cracker came up and asked him what paper he worked for. And he said the New York Post. And Ted would say, well, let me ask you. He said, then, no, the questioner said, is that there a Negro paper? And he said, well, let me ask you a question. If I have a drop of Negro blood in me, does that make me a Negro? He said, and the guy said, yes. And so he said, well, then it's a Negro paper because I'm the drop of Negro blood on the New York Post.
Myron, of course. The book is dedicated to you, Mike.
I think this would have been 1976. I was a full-time dayside copy boy, copy person at the Post. And at that point in time, Clyde Haberman was a reporter with us. And this was, still hot type, so it's all these typewriters, manual typewriters. And at that point in time, Walt Frazier, star New York Knicks, was on the team. His nickname was Clyde. So there would always be in the Post, I want to say, good Clyde headlines. So I would decorate Clyde's typewriter with Clyde headlines.
I think since the book is dedicated to Myron Rushetzky, who should stand up and take a bow. Thank you.
I really want to thank all the Silurians that we interviewed, because there were many. And the first one that I called was Joe Berger, because he wrote a terrific article in the Silurian newsletter about his experience at the New York Post when he went to Egypt and they wanted him to go sit on a camel and say, "Our man in Cairo," and he refused to do it. So anyway, thank you to all the Silurians.
Susan, Frank, Sheryl, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.